the next defendant of the proposition, Mr. Hitchens, to come and to make his case.
Madam Chairman, thank you so much for your kind introduction and indeed for placing me among all these incredibly nice people. I here am not a nice person. I come here as a jobbing scribbler and a former colonial oppressor. Begin with some advantages and some disadvantages.
Come back, all is forgiven.
You won't say that by the time I've finished. The problem for me here is, and this is a problem which I often face in these discussions, is that my opponents are so nice. They're not the people I meet on the internet. They're not the people who send me those letters and emails denouncing me as a boneheaded moron and saying other things which, even on an evening such as this, I'm not prepared to repeat to you about the profession of religion or the support of religion. It's very strange, in fact, the way in which what seems to me to be the true character of modern atheism recedes on occasions like this when you hope to confront it. And therefore, to some extent, I will have to address here things that have not been said by people present, but which are important in this argument. The proposition here is one, and this is a city of modest proposals, as you will know, a proposal of extreme modesty. It actually has no other claim than that we request, as supporters of the theist idea, that our belief that there might be a God should be tolerated as a reasonable one in society. And you might think that this really isn't much of a stretch, and that most of you would be prepared to say, all right then, very well. But in fact, as we've already seen from the Senator's arguments, the idea that this position can even begin to be seen as reasonable is being widely dismissed among people who regard themselves as intelligent and educated. Now, my point is quite simply this. If we examine the world we live in, are faced with a considerable difficulty. I'm often told in this argument by atheists, when I say to them that they, as I do, have a faith, I am told, oh, I don't have a faith, I have no belief. And I say to them that it's quite possibly true that a wombat has no belief, or even a tomcat has no belief, but a human being is not such a thing, or a cowpat, come to that. A human being is neither a thing nor an animal. A human being has the capacity to examine the universe. And I do not think that anybody who seriously maintains that confronted with a vast and intricate universe engineered to extraordinarily fine-tuned tolerances can conceivably say that they've never at any stage been at least puzzled, troubled, and disturbed by the possibility that it may not have got there by accident. I mean, there is an old saying in the southern states of the United States that if you find a turtle on a fence post, it didn't get there by accident. Frankly, if you find a large universe rotating in the middle of nothing, then it's tempting to think this didn't get there by accident. I don't think that any sensate person can really seriously maintain that it's never crossed their mind. The problem is how you react to this. The standard, again, the atheist evasive reaction is to say that the default position of any normal human being in modern society is that the theist idea is a nonsense which doesn't need even to be dismissed because there is no evidence for it. And here we get into the area of what is evidence. And what is evidence for the theist or the atheist position? I'm actually quite happy to stand here and say that I see a great deal of evidence. I read the books of Professor Dawkins and others, and indeed of my late brother. I see a great deal of evidence for the atheist position. I think that it is a powerful position and one which disturbs night and day the believer, and so it should. And there's absolutely nothing good in being a predominant position, whether religious or non-religious, in any society. Absolutely nothing good about it at all, and I'll come to that and exactly why it is so bad for any position to be dominant. We're troubled by it. I don't believe that the other side are untroubled by it. I think that when we are arguing about this, we're arguing about something very profound. We're arguing about a choice. I think that anybody reduced to absolutely nothing but fact and reason is impelled, whatever his or her inclination, to take an agnostic position. You cannot get beyond it. If you simply want to reach a position on the question of the existence of God with no other tools than those of fact and reason, you cannot get beyond agnosticism, whoever you are. And that applies to me, and it applies to my opponents. And this is part of my proposition. I retreat in this argument. I retreat as far as I can to my most remote and smallest fastness, because I know that it is secure. And that is what this motion is asking you to do, to recognize that my fastness is secure, that I am entitled as an intelligent, educated person to believe what I believe, and actually, here's the important thing, to pass it on to my children. Now, on the question of evidence, my favorite summations of evidence, so I think Leibniz's question to anybody who says that it's not interesting as to whether there is a God or not, the simple question, why is there something rather than nothing, is such a preoccupying question to any thoughtful person that I don't know anybody who can even begin to consider it without at least asking themselves the possibility of whether my explanation might be right. I have another favorite version, which is a snatch of verse. The earth is crowned with heaven, and every common bush afire with God, but only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit round it and eat blackberries. This is a good summary of the attitude of religious people to the world and to the attitude of those who are not religious. And the question of knowledge is beautifully summed up in what is possibly the most poetic few verses in the entire Bible. And of course I would, in this case, quote from the authorized King James Version rather than the inferior ones being palmed off on the It's from the 38th chapter of Job, Job, which I believe, by the way, to be a parable, not an account of any events. The 3rd verse to the 6th. Gird up now thy loins like a man, for this is God speaking from the whirlwind. Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare, if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Or who hath stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof? There is no human being, living, dead, now or in the future, who can answer that question, who could answer that question, or will answer that question. We don't know. We have to choose. On what basis do we choose? I choose on two very simple bases. One, on the basis of justice. Any student of society and history knows that there is no justice. The world is much, much more like Game of Thrones than it is like the Kingdom of Heaven. There is no justice. You will not find it. You will not find it where there has been genocide. You will not find it where there has been massacre. You will not find it where there has been corruption. You will not find it where crimes have gone unpunished. You will not find it where people have been thrown into prison for crimes they have not been committed. Ceaselessly and repeatedly in our temporal lives, we commit injustice. If there is justice, it is to be found elsewhere. And I believe the only place in which it can possibly be found is the eternal, which is why I hope for the eternal, because I hope for justice, as I believe every single civilized human being hopes for justice. For hope is what this is built on. The other thing is I cannot bear the belief that all those who I have known, who are no longer with us, do not exist, that they have no further existence, that they are finished, that life ends with death. Now, people say, are you afraid of death? I don't think people are afraid of death, people are afraid of dying. They're afraid of the pain, the misery, the discomfort, the embarrassment, the squalor of it, and quite reasonably so. What they're afraid of about dying is not dying, but of the fact that they don't know. And again, whereof we do not know, thereof we cannot speak. And again, I ask simply to consider, those of you who come here as believers in the atheist faith, to consider the possibility that you may be mistaken about this, because you cannot conceivably know that you are right any more than I can. I choose, as I say, because I think one thing is preferable to another. I think I'm not a very nice person. I know that my behavior has been immensely improved by the belief that the world is actually bending towards the arc of justice, and eternity is so, and I would recommend it to anybody as a cure for being not very nice. But these are minor questions, except in this way, that the reason for choice cannot be only one of pure reason, because there isn't ever going to be one. You're going to have to choose it on other grounds. And this leads me to my other very interesting observation among all those sorts of atheists who aren't here tonight, which is when you ask them the simple question, why exactly is it that you are an atheist? None of them will ever answer. I know only one atheist who's ever even begun to attempt to answer it, and that is Thomas Nagel, a a very fine writer and philosopher, who has written that he is often troubled by the question of why he so much wants there not to be a God. And this is unusual in its honesty and clarity and directness. Most atheists don't want to discuss it, and I think the reason why they don't want to discuss it is actually quite simple. That their reasons for not wanting there to be a God are their reasons for not wanting eternity to be as I believe it to be, their reasons for their not wanting their actions to be judged on the basis of a hard, unalterable scale which we do not decide. Because of course, when you seek justice for others, you inevitably seek it for yourself. And in a society which has offered us, yes please.
Yeah, so it sounded like you were saying it's reasonable to believe theism is correct because it makes you happy. Would that be
No, I don't. No, that's not why it's reasonable. It's why it's a perfectly acceptable thing to do. It's reasonable to believe it because I have absolutely no reason to know one way or the other. It's open to us to believe it. My own straightforward argument is that we choose. You choose, I choose. Your choice is legitimate. My choice is legitimate. One of us is probably wrong. We don't know which. But I will go no further than that. It's a position of extreme modesty. I'm surprised you're not more impressed by it. But I would just return to this point. The very simple point of what we are actually dealing with here is the readiness of people like me to accept the views of people like the people who aren't here, that there is no God and probably that they hate him, and the readiness of atheists, which doesn't seem to me to exist, to accept that theist believers have any right to be in the public sphere at all. And I am fascinated by a very, very important part of this argument, which was put partly by Richard Dawkins, when he began to compare. First, let me say this one small thing here. What do you think should happen to child abusers, to sexual abusers of children? Do you think they should be severely punished? Do you think they have any rights to exist without punishment and reproof? Do you not think they're people who should be utterly marginalized from society because of the horrible things that they do? I doubt whether I find a single dissenter from that belief here. Richard Dawkins repeatedly compares the education of children in religious belief to priestly child abuse. The use of this language is inflammatory and intolerant to me almost beyond belief. And what he also did was he recommended, and this is all available on the web for you to read it in full, an essay by a distinguished psychologist called Nicholas Humphrey, called What Shall We Tell the Children? And in this essay, Nicholas Humphrey quite clearly says that he believes, and this is what people who don't believe in freedom of speech always say, he believes completely in freedom of speech except in this just one instance. And I'll leave you to guess what it is. This is what we're up against. We're up against a strain of thought so powerful, so confident, in my view so arrogant, and so sure of its correctness, that it is beginning to treat those who dissent from it exactly as badly as the medieval church treated those who dissented from it. And it is a very simple point, it seems to me, to make tonight. That this, from the point of view of either atheists or theists, must be wrong. That anybody who is serious about, even begins to take himself seriously about a member of a civilized and free society, must recognize from the beginning to the end of every argument that his opponent has the freedom to voice his opinion, to pass that opinion on to his own children. And what we are actually seeing among us, though as I say there are no representatives of this case here this evening, what we're actually seeing among us is a movement for precisely the opposite of that. Now, I've had a look at one of Mr. Nugent's pamphlets, and it says, I'm delighted to say, personal freedoms 1C, freedom of expression should be limited only by the need to respect the rights and freedoms of others. I completely agree. And I think that this is a statement of extraordinary goodness, but it does not seem to me to be a statement which he shares with several of the most prominent supporters of his cause. And I hope very much, in the course of his remarks this evening, that he will thoroughly disassociate himself from this view and support what is in essence the spirit of this motion, which is that we should be free to believe what is reasonable and what we believe to be reasonable, because there is absolutely no reason why anybody in this building or this city can ever tell us that it isn't. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for this counter-position. The proposition for the proposition. I think there were three main points. One was some of the advocates of atheism really make it hard. They, if you want, overextend secularism to being the default position and basically making something that is an option, a practical option, into the rational, if you want, the model of rationality. Those were the people that you were quoting. Over against that, he was reminding us of the beauty of the universe rotating in nothingness. One is entitled to wonder, how did that happen? He quoted Job. I can come back to that later as a theologian. And he gave one really important argument with regard to justice, that the questions that basically questions of humanists, what about past suffering? What about lost generations? Humanists can only, if you want, put these questions, but they don't have an answer to them. So there's an ethical reason to keep these questions open. At least those were the points that I got from what he was saying, and that nobody of us in the end can know one of us is right. We don't know in advance whether the atheist is right or whether the believer is right. The other person will find out at some stage. So the final position to answer to this defense of theism is Michael Nugent. So please take the floor.
Thank you. I'd like to start with saying that I agree with Peter that I would rather be discussing things with my colleagues here than with some of the people I meet on the internet. So is theism a reasonable philosophical position? I suggest that the proponents have a few tests to meet on this. Firstly, they have to defend theism and not deism. Theism is the belief that there is a God that not only created the universe, but that loves us, that has a personal relationship with us, that sometimes intervenes in the universe and its workings on our behalf, and that who will communicate morality to us and who will eventually judge us for eternity. Now that's a different argument to the deistic argument, which is that there's a creator of the universe who created the universe and essentially then wandered off and left it to its own devices. So I suggest that for the purposes of tonight, you should be asking if the proponents have met the test of a theistic God rather than a deistic one. The second test is that they must show that theism is reasonable. And I suggest that's not merely saying that it's reasonable that there might be a God. I mean, I can accept that there might be a God. I'm a strong atheist. I strongly believe that there isn't a God, but I might be mistaken. I think I think we should always be open to the idea that we should be mistaken. And so I think that the proponents here have to go beyond arguing that there might be a God and have to show that it's reasonable, that on the balance of probabilities at least, that it's more likely than not that there is a theistic God. That's the essence of a reasonable position. The word reason and rational have their roots in the word ratio, and that we should be trying to proportion our beliefs to the currently best available evidence. Faith, on the other hand, is believing things disproportionately to the best available evidence, either because you want to or because you're afraid not to, but it is a different approach and it goes beyond reason. And the third point is, I think our proponents have to show, is that theism is philosophically reasonable. So we're not discussing whether it's a useful belief, we're not discussing whether it's a comforting belief, we're discussing whether or not it's true. As it happens on the other issue, I mean, I think there are numerous studies to show that atheists and secularists are less nationalistic, less dogmatic, less ethnocentric, less racist, less homophobic, more politically tolerant than our religious people. There are numerous studies that show that, on average, there are numerous studies to show that that secular liberal democracies have lower murder rates, lower abortion rates, lower sexually transmitted diseases, lower a lot of the social indicators that religion is theoretically thought to protect us against. So even if theism was more helpful and useful to society, which it isn't, that's still not the point that we're discussing tonight. What we've got to argue tonight is what is true, not what is useful. Now, Patrick referred to a couple of things that I think are useful, but I wanted to use a definition that Patrick's used in one of his recent books for the purpose of tonight, because I think it's a reasonable definition to work on. That theology is the elaboration of truths revealed by God and held on faith because they surpass what we can know by natural reason. I think that's a definition that we could probably use as a working definition of theology. And if we use that definition and we ask, can philosophy be used from a rational perspective to support aspects of theology? Certainly it can. But does it make theology reasonable? It doesn't, because theology by that definition would go beyond reason. And that whole debate goes back as far as medieval times in terms of the Augustinian project, when philosophers were and theologians indeed were trying to marry the Christian faith with Greek reason from Greek philosophy. And that project, without going into all the details of it, I mean, ultimately led to a split between theology and the arts because they were ultimately irreconcilable. In terms of another one of the philosophical issues that Patrick touched on, in terms of the difference between kind of internal subjective approaches to the idea of God and external objective approaches, I think from my perspective, I think I have to go for the objective. I think that the subjective, in philosophical terms, phenomenological approach is, it's really difficult to distinguish it from hallucinations if you're not going to bring in objective tests as well as a counterbalance to it. I mean, subjectively, I could be Roy Keane or David Bowie, but objectively, I'm not. And also, subjectively, God seems to appear to different people in different subjective guises around the world. So I'm going to be addressing the philosophical arguments from an objective or metaphysical approach. I'll touch on a couple of the things that Peter said. First of all, in terms of all atheists must be agnostic, I think virtually all atheists, Peter, are agnostics and would accept that we're agnostics. Agnosticism isn't like a middle ground between theism and atheism. Atheism and theism are about what you believe. I think we probably have some common ground in this. Do you believe there's a God? Do you believe that there isn't a God? I strongly believe there isn't a God. But do I claim to know that there isn't a God? I don't. And on that basis, I'm also an agnostic. So you can be an agnostic atheist or an agnostic theist if you believe what it is that you believe, but simultaneously you don't claim to be able to know that is the case. I just, as an aside, I just want to touch on one of the things that you said about Richard Dawkins comparing teaching children religion to child abuse. What Richard was talking about there was a woman who had said to him that she had been abused and that she had also been taught about hell, and that she felt that being taught about hell caused more psychological problems for her than the abuse did. So it wasn't just something that Richard was coming up from just as an idea of his own. You talked about the idea of choosing whether or not to believe that there's a God, and on the basis that we don't know. Now, and you said hope for justice, and the idea that you can't bear the idea that people that you knew don't exist or were part of your reasons for making that particular choice. Well, to kind of slightly trivialise it, I'm a supporter of Bohemians Football Club, and football is kind of worse than religion, because you can leave your religion but you can't leisure football club, so I'm kind of stuck with those. We're essentially an amateur club and have recently lost our ground, Daleyman Park, through financial mismanagement. Now I can't know, and you can't know, whether Bohemians are going to win the European Champions League. But I can't just choose to believe, or at least I could just choose to believe that Bohemians will win the Champions League 20 times in succession within my lifetime. It doesn't make it a reasonable belief. It's an absolutely ridiculous belief. And yet it is a slightly more reasonable belief than theism, because it is within the bounds of rules of nature. I'm happy to take a question.
I have no idea who these Bohemians are. I assume they're some kind of sporting.
They are indeed, yes.
The difference between what you're saying and what I'm saying is that your proposition is testable, and the proposition as to whether God is or is not testable, and therefore it's a category error, they're not the same thing.
Well, I would suggest that in fact makes it even, well, I'll come to that in a minute. So suggest that makes it even less reasonable to believe in a God, because choosing to believe in untestable propositions in terms of the specifics is just entirely random. Whereas there are, I'll come to the detail. I'll not cover this again later on in the talk, but that there are ways of proportioning your belief to the currently best available evidence, even though the ultimate outcome is untestable. In terms of your suggestion that atheists don't want God to exist, my wife died a few years ago of cancer. I'd love to see Anne again. I've no vested interest in there being no afterlife. I've no vested interest in there being no God. It's just where the evidence is leading me. I think, I know you didn't deal with this here, but from being aware of your writing, I think your theism, from my reading of your theism, seems to be based on a kind of traditional civil English Protestantism, which you contrast with the sort of...
It's very nice of you to put it like that.
It is indeed. I think it is, in fairness. No, it's not. I'm regularly derided as being West Brit for some of my activities here. But it kind of actually... sorry, something's just come to mind here. It's an English comedian called Stuart Lee, who I remember doing a routine where he was talking about the IRA to an English audience. He was asking the audience to applaud the IRA. He said they were gentlemen terrorists. He said they were much more decent than Al Qaeda. Their bomb warnings and that. He said they were much more decent because they were British. He said they didn't want to be, but they were. So I think that your theism seems to have been formed, correct me if I'm wrong, by contrasting that with your experiences in Soviet Union and in Mogadishu and so on. And whereas they were both really bad places, the common factor in those was, in fact, one of them was Islamic, obviously Somalia, but the common factor in those was faith and dogma. And you can apply faith and dogma to communism just as easily as you can to religion. So I think the underlying problem in terms of reason is faith and dogma, is believing things disproportionately to the currently best available evidence, and believing things without questioning. So how do you then evaluate the claims? I mean, in terms of proportionality, and one of the difficulties, and this kind of arises from your point about it not being testable, is normally when we're trying to evaluate whether something is true or not, what we do is we proportion our beliefs to the evidence, and as the claims become more implausible, we raise the barrier of evidence that we need in order to accept that it's true. But with theistic claims, we lower the barrier. As the claims become more implausible, we lower the barrier of evidence that we demand of ourselves, to the extent that we are, as you say, basing our lives on not only implausible claims, but literally untestable claims. So I'm going to try and evaluate some of the main characteristics that are normally attributed to the theistic gods. First of all, that it loves us and it has a personal relationship with us, and by us I mean human beings on planet Earth. Now, I think if you look at the scale of the universe, The observable universe is over 100,000 million galaxies, each of which is over 100,000 million stars like our sun. And the idea that all of that was created by a personal theistic God in order that it might have a personal relationships with human beings on one tiny planet seems pretty fanciful, particularly given that even on this tiny planet there have been 5,000 million species, 99% of which are extinct, and of the remaining 50 million species, apparently we alone on the planet, and we alone in our galaxy, and we alone in the universe are the only ones lucky enough to have this personal relationship with the creator of all of this vastness. I mean, how self-centered is that? In reality, human life, I think, is what we would expect based on natural evolution. It's not as we would expect based on a... Yeah, I'll take your question.
Is it right to say that we're the only ones who have this personal relationship if we don't know if there's life on other planets?
Well, if there is, Jesus is going to be pretty busy going around from planet to planet. But sir, if we just take our planet, there are so many species on our planet that humans seem to feel are more important than those. Yeah.
But just to answer that, life on our planet is incredible because it doesn't exist. I mean, how can it exist? We're humans. Life on our planet, it can never happen. It just doesn't exist because there is another planet Earth, billions of miles away, or hundreds of millions of miles away.
Okay.
There must be human beings there. We don't know what to be there. It could be Jenny Tots.
Okay. Now, if we take this planet here, I mean, in terms of humans on this planet here, and this God that loves us, we can only live on a small part of the planet's surface. That part of it has volcanoes and earthquakes and tsunamis. We can die within minutes of being deprived of oxygen. We can die from birth defects or cancers or ectopic pregnancies or any number of other issues. We can do things that are counterproductive to our survival, and those of us that do the least number of things that are counterproductive to our survival are the ones that survive. Now, all of that is quite consistent with natural evolution, and not so much, I would suggest, proportionally with the idea of a loving God. In terms of God intervening in the working of the universe, he's supposed to do this in a couple of ways. First of all, there's historical ones in scripture, such as drowning everybody on the planet apart from one family because he's upset with himself, or impregnating a virgin in order to give birth to himself, or helping Muhammad to fly on a winged horse, or helping Muhammad to split the moon over Mecca, or appearing in Joseph Smith's hat in order to attire him in magic underwear. Now, of all of these various things that this God intervenes, you'll notice that mainstream Christians will immediately notice the implausibility of the Muslim and Mormon miracles. And you'll notice that Muslims will immediately notice the implausibility of the mainstream Christian and Mormon miracles. And the Mormons are probably falling over laughing at the Scientologists and the Hare Krishnas. So everybody is good at noticing how silly the other religions' miracles are, but not so much their own. Now, there's also alleged modern interventions, such as the miracle cures at Lourdes. Now, you'll notice as well that people will attribute... Yeah, Peter?
You're doing that thing that atheists always do. You're confusing the issue of theism with the issue of the characteristics of individual theistic religions. It's a bit illegitimate. I just thought I'd point it out, apart from the misrepresentation of our view of the universe you did earlier on, but I was speaking of just Protestantism, I thought.
Well, you see, the thing about theism is that you, because you're moving beyond deism and beyond the idea of there being just a God that created the universe and wandered away, theism cannot be divorced from having some version of claiming to be able to know the mind of this creator, and each religion almost uniquely claims that they're the ones that are able to know the mind of that creator. But again, the people who will attribute these interventions and cures and miracles to their loving God, typically don't attribute getting the illness in the first place to the loving God. It's just the bits that they like. I have some stuff that I was going to go into about Lourdes, which is actually quite entertaining, but I don't think I'm going to have time to. I'll move on to the next one, which is the idea that this God is the source and communicator of our morality. Now, Plato addressst that centuries ago with the Euthyphro dilemma. Does God cause something to be good simply by declaring it to be good? in which case morality is arbitrary, because he might have, if he had chosen, decided that torturing infants for no reason is a good thing to do. Or does God assess things as being good based on some independent criteria from himself, in which case we don't need the God and we can just try to identify the criteria itself. Now, from a naturalistic perspective and an atheistic perspective, morality is essentially a natural function of our brains. As social animals, it's evolved as social animals to enable us to live together. We've developed attributes. I'll finish the point first, and then if I have time I'll take the question, such as compassion and empathy and reciprocity and fairness and justice. The Quran, for example, says that you should flog adulterers, and then it says, and don't let your compassion stop you. Now, why else would that be there other than when the Quran was being written, that there were Muslims that realised that that was an unjust punishment and that it wasn't based on fairness and justice and empathy and compassion. And the fourth issue, or the fourth criteria that is attributed to this theistic God is typically is that it will judge us for eternity after we die. I'll try to take your point if I have time after I've made this comment. But there's no evidence, first of all, that we're even going to have an afterlife, never mind that we're going to be judged in an afterlife. We don't yet understand how consciousness works. It's one of three big things that science hasn't figured out yet. Consciousness, nature of consciousness, what happened before the Big Bang, and how life started on Earth. We know how it continued through evolution. We don't know how it started. But we do know that if we shut down certain parts of our brain, that certain parts of our consciousness cease to function. So how could it be the case that if we shut down all of our brain, that our consciousness suddenly magically all starts to function again in some imaginary afterlife? And why would it be the case that it's only humans? Why would it be the case that of all the species, that only humans have this supposed immortal soul that is loved by this creature? Again, we have a self-centered, self-serving belief that coincidentally happens to benefit us. Just a concluding statement maybe. I'll take your question before I make my concluding comments.
Well, I was going to go back to the philosophy of the Greeks that you mentioned.
Yeah.
In Plato's world, he
Yeah.
divided the world into four. And of that, in the four sectors, he said there was coarse giants who believe in riches, wealth, ambition, gold and silver, money. The Let's Party Brigade of 2008 crashed. The second people, he said out there, are the gentle giants. The people who believe in the material world. It's testable. It's mathematically physical. It's scientifically chemistry. And you've got empirical science for it. And you've got best available proof. And the rest untestable. And then there's the friends of the forms, which is the sector that there is no proof for, no mathematics for it. There's no science for it. There's nothing that's testable for it. It's the vices and the virtues. Now, if that's a concept, that is a reality that they believed in, it's a possibility that's out there. So beyond that, you don't. And the fourth one, they said, is there is a monist. Now, you can take it in your material world of there's a Big Bang, or you can take it that there's a creator of the universe. But the problem is it benevolent or malevolent? And that's the problem that might be causing in it. But as I said, if you think a child abuser, you are going to do what you're going to do to a child abuser, well then you throw the first stone at it. And you be the person that does it. Because in reality, you have the four realities. And if you're a philosopher, you abide by all four, and you work through it, and you try to decide which one might be the reality that we want to live in benevolent or malevolent, depending which way you go to go.
Okay, I don't have time to really respond to that. I'll talk to you about it later on. I'll just conclude by reminding of the test that I suggest that we should use for this, is which is more likely, that this theistic God who loves us, who has a personal relationship with us, who sometimes intervenes in the working of the universe for our benefit, who's the source and communicator of our morality and who judges us for eternity in an afterlife, is it more likely that that creature actually exists, or was he invented by humans as a way of explaining things that we didn't understand at a time that we didn't have the science to understand it? And so I'd say, can philosophy be used to support parts of theology? Yes, it can. Does philosophy make theology reasonable? No, it doesn't. Theology is philosophy plus faith, which brings us beyond what philosophy and reason can justify. Theology is essentially philosophy without rules. It's based on the imagination of theologians, and to believe that everything in the universe happened on the basis of a personal theistic God creating all of this for the benefit of human beings on planet Earth, who coincidentally happen to be us, is so self-centred and so arrogant to claim that I ask you to agree that theism is not a reasonable philosophical stance. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Michael. He started out with making clear the difference between deism and theism, and that is very important because deism is really not a very interesting position. It is about belief in a personal God, therefore a God who will be answerable also to human suffering. That is a much more clear, radical thesis than deism, which kind of says there has to be some cause for all this, but we don't really engage with that cause anymore. The main points were, with all the if you want, responses and reflections on previous speakers, the main points were that it is reasonable to possibly assume there might be a God, but that the question is this true? So we are caught, or we are oriented, directed by the question of truth. And that's where Michael tried to show that there is no empirical evidence, and that all the evidence that we can get really points in another direction. So the points that he made as speaking for the rationality of the atheist stance really were based on, if you want, scientific elements, the vastness of the universe, the fact that it will come to an end, peter out at some stage. So all these are empirical, or all these are statements that theism has to, be able to answer. So objectively, it's not a reasonable stance. Miracles, interventions into history by God are really very, very unlikely from that position. Finally, the morality question. Do we need a God to keep human rights? Should we really say that that is necessary, or do they not stand on their own? So that's a question we have to come back to. But first of all, after all these strong beliefs and all these very eloquent ways of putting them to you, you have two options. And I would like now to put the motion to the House. This House believes theism is a reasonable philosophical stance. To make up your minds, and to those who are in favor of this proposition to put up their hands, and the hands will be counted. And secondly, those opposed to the motion, would they please raise their hands?
Against
67 to 68. Do you want to recount?
No, that's okay. If only God would go.
Could I? So I'd like to make a few concluding observations and make a few comments from a theological position. First of all, perceptions. I think overarching themes and questions that need to be further pursued are, first of all, the question of what do we call rationality, what is reason. Clearly, in Kant, there are two words for it. Reason is Vernunft, and Verstand is understanding. So what runs in English as rationality would really be Verstand. And that is what we do kind of in our everyday research and in our everyday connections with reality. Vernunft is the principled capability to ask for the unconditioned. So you have the father of autonomous morality, of the turn to the subject, of the destroyer for the metaphysical proofs of God, who is saying reason is more than rationality. So that's an ongoing debate. I just want to highlight that. It has also a consequence for the way in which you see religions. If you see what status do religious beliefs have and what status does philosophy have. If you go to somebody like John Rawls, everything, including Kantianism, utilitarianism, all these reasonable belief systems are basically comprehensive doctrines. So you don't have a philosophy anymore that can adjudicate or that can judge about this truth claim. So that is a problematic way of putting philosophy at the same level as different, if you want, practical self-understandings. So all these questions, rationality, Vernunft, and so on, would have to be discussed with the consequences that it has for how we understand these historical communities of believers, and are the Kantians like them and the utilitarians, or are they approaches to thinking which really need to battle things out, as we've been doing tonight, rather than saying, oh, you're a religion over there with whom I can coexist, but we don't share anything. I think philosophy has to insist that we do share this quest for truth, and it's a problem if also philosophy gets kind of put into this tower of being one more or many more comprehensive doctrines. That's the first question, rationality, reason, and so on. The second question for me is, of course, the one for morality. I'm in ethics. So do we really need a God to explain our obligation to other people? No. Kant says we are, because of our freedom, we are obliged to respect and anticipate the needs and the flourishing of the freedom of the other. We don't need God for that, but the question of hope is something which we can't dismiss, because we know very often our best intentions can't be realized. And the question that you raised with regard to the histories of victims that can't be recuperated, that is an open question. It's not clear which answer is more moral. The answer that says they can't be redeemed, or the answer that says there is a justice, there is an eschatology, there is a kind of possibility of making up for the injustice that they have suffered in the only life they had in this world. So the morality question, therefore, is something which is equally open. The heroism, if you want, of an existentialist stance, but one can also make a case there for the rationality of belief in a God. Then another big question, I thought, society and state. Ivana Barczyk was saying that, if you want, the Catholic Church was kind of a welfare state in itself. Also, it's a big question whether in a society, religion, if you want, should agnosticism be the default position? Should a state insist that only, if you want, an open position of saying we can't know is the only possible one? Or should a society be marked by many different movements? Green, feminist, labor, all these different historical movements that have created our cultures, and should they all, as Ricoeur says, be invigorated by their unkept promises? So I think that's an important question. Should they be competing in the public realm, everybody with their views of the human good, and united by their view of the right, which is human rights, or should one say, you can't really show your differences, you can't really show your particularities, we really want to have everything neutral and unexpressed. So finally, from a theological position, my sympathies for making the rationality of faith in God with Patrick Masterson, I also have to have a caveat there, because if you're saying every human person has a kind of an actualized relationship to God, then you would be saying really atheism is not a possibility. You would be delegitimizing atheism as a practical option. And no theologian wants to do that, really. I mean, okay, there are some who do, but it's not a good idea to do so in theology. Because if you're saying everybody has an inborn God consciousness, that devalues then the encounters, if you want, with messengers of God, prophets, Jesus in history. We couldn't have known that God is benevolent, that was a point made, if we hadn't encountered a person who lived God's promise in that way. We wouldn't know that God, the flood, basically, that God is somebody who keeps a promise and who has an ark in, who has a sign of the faithfulness of God to God's creation. I mean, that's what the Noah story is about. The Noah story is the covenant of God with all humanity. It's not about drowning everyone apart from one family. It's about saying this earth should and will prevail. Yeah, so is that historical testimony that we get in the different basic documents, prophecies, what the prophets say about God. It's an ethical God. It's the God who protects the orphan and the widow. So that God is not a tribal God. Yeah, it's an internal development that God himself, herself, is to be judged and up to the standards of morality. So that's where I would see a huge discussion, and where I really think theology joins with philosophy in understanding the facticity of the human person. As you said, the question, is there anything, why is there anything and not nothing? And also, why is anybody of ourselves there and not just a matter of chance? That question of facticity unites theology and philosophy, but in the end it's a question to our practical self-understanding, which route we take. So, thanks for that. Oh, another...
Quick question. How does the chair vote, or is that excessively empirical?
Yes, especially after this tight. Well, no, I didn't vote. I don't think the chair should vote. I think it's over to you. You're kind of working out of the arguments of this evening. But I think it was a brilliant idea to put forward this theme at the beginning of the new term of 2016, which again is a year where we're thinking about the unkept promises of a tradition, and where we're thinking of what other people did, the legacies that are still ours to work out. So, thanks for your interest, thanks for staying, and thanks to the really remarkable speakers for their eloquent pleas.